You're listening to Dairy Voice by Dairy Business News, a podcast exclusively for the dairy industry.
One of our sponsors of the Dairy Voice podcast is National DHIA. NDHIA ensures information accuracy and represents their members' interests. They are the direct voice for the dairy information industry. To find out more, go to dhia.org.
What's the largest part of your cow's diet? Your forage. But every farm is different, and so is every ration. Whatever your crop, whatever your conditions, there's a Forage Mate inoculant for that. The Forage Mate inoculant portfolio delivers a wide range of proven performers, each uniquely formulated to maintain superior standards and consistency to help your cows reach their full potential. Flex to your forage goals at foragemate.com or contact your Diamond V Forage Mate representative today.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are in your day, welcome to the Dairy Voice podcast by Dairy Business News. I'm your host, Connie Kuber, with Sealpro Silage Barrier Films by Connor AgriScience. Thanks for joining us today. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends. And as we begin the new year, both Dairy Business News and Connor AgriScience and Sealpro wish you and your family a happy and prosperous new year. My guests today are Darren Usinowicz and Tom Eaton from Agricultural Consultants Services, ACS. And we're going to talk about a review of the 2024 crop year, the impact that we've had of unprecedented flooding, and variability in management strategies for manure and crops. This is going to be a two-parter. So when you're finished with this one, look on the website to be notified of the episode 2. So this is episode 1. Well, we've breathed through that final sigh of relief after harvest, watching another crop year come and go. But I'm a firm believer in studying the past to help make the future better, and how we did with crops, weather, and management can teach us a lot about how we can manage that the next year. We do that at Sealpro all the time, and I'm really interested to hear what Darren and Tom have to say about the past year and some other ideas that they have for doing a better job in the future. Darren, why don't we start with you? Introduce yourself, please, and give us a little background on how you came to this point in your career in ACS.
Sure. Thanks, Connie. So I'm certified planner, a AEM planner in New York State. I'm also a nutrient management planner in Vermont. I've been here for 17 years at ACS. And originally I started, like so many of us did, pulling soil samples. Started literally from the ground and have worked my way up. Lots of training and education. And with Tom, we manage quite a few Eastern New York CAFOs in their crop management plan, as well as their compliance strategies. And compliance is really where I guess my main focus is in our team.
Tom Eaton, I've been with ACS since 2006 and moved up to Vermont with an opportunity to grow ACS's reach in Vermont and New England, as well as Eastern New York, and have been up here ever since. Darren and I have kind of grown our business to manage around 100,000 acres on over 60 CAFO-sized farms, all through Vermont, Eastern New York, and a handful in Connecticut. My focus on our team is account management, relationship, and the agronomy side of things. The team rolls pretty nice and evenly.
Let's just jump right in and do a review of the 2024 crop year, the impact of this flooding, and the management strategy. So what are some examples of some successes and some failures that you saw on this year's farms? And I want you to keep in mind too, I know we're talking about, you work in the upper East. I'm from California. We have listeners from all over the country. So we're interested to find out what happened there and how you managed that.
I think first we have to recognize that the flooding really started in 2023. We had one flood in July and then another in December, and then a year to the day in July of 2024, it happened again. It was kind of 2 years of rebuilding and recognizing where issues occurred and trying to manage what happened to crops and fields. A lot of farms struggled with how to rebuild once their crops were looking really great in 23 and what to do from there. And then to have it happen again in 24, I think was pretty disheartening. But definitely Tom tends to be more on the field side and in touch with the annual implications for everybody.
Some of the successes we've had while dealing with these terrible events, I guess we've really learned how to evaluate flooded crops and their impact on forage quality. Most of our clients are dairy farms, so this is feed that's all going to be chopped and siled and hopefully fed to dairy cows. And so through a lot of collaboration with land-grant universities and nutritionists and farmers and just everybody kind of really getting out there, I would say we learned a lot. So I have to take that as a success, even though we had a ton of crop losses and crop failures. We did learn a lot. Some of the things we learned were there is a benefit to flooding at that point of the season versus at the end of the season. We had time for our crops to fight back, do some form of recovery. Rains that came after the flooding events helped wash some of the crops off and get them to a point where through testing throughout the growing season, we felt comfortable enough to harvest the crops and put them up for feed. That was definitely in 2023 was a much scarier thing than it was in 2024. So there's successes there in terms of what we learned and how to do that, and in the use of inoculants and chopping higher than we normally would to leave some of the residue in the field where, the heavy residue collects a little lower on the plants. But, we're talking about 8, 9, 10-foot tall corn right before tassel, all underwater for about 48 hours. And that's about the limit corn can take before it just completely starts to shut down. In terms of failures, I don't think it's any fault of any farms, but yeah, we definitely had a lot of losses. I think some of the things we tried to do afterwards that were failures, we had a lot of sediment on these fields. We saw a lot of corn die. We knew we had to try and reestablish some feedstock to harvest for the animals. And I think we waited a little too long in terms of trying to let the ground dry out. And what we found was that the ground had essentially sealed over with this really fine sediment, trapping all the moisture underneath the ground. And once we went out there saying, man, it's just not dry enough, we can't get out there and kind of replant or work some of this debris back down into the soil. And we found that, 4, 5, 6 inches under the soil, it was dry. And so in 2024, we definitely didn't wait as long to get back into these fields and try to get them back to a point where we could plant some rescue crops. In terms of how we reacted to the flooding, those are some examples of successes and failures.
Get your Sealpro silage barrier film today. Protect the seed, fertilizer, labor, and expensive inputs that you've invested in. Choose best-in-class Sealpro now in 3 different versions: traditional 2-roll application, our new co-rolled application, and super simple and wildly successful 1-layer film, Sealpro 1. It's easy to buy, easy to use. Contractor covering? We'll work with them. Learn more at sealprosilage.com. That's SEALPRO silage.com. Family owned and operated for over 25 years. 559-779-5961. That's 559-779-5961.
I would also add that there was so much focus in 23, focusing on road damage and infrastructure damage, people recovering, and rightfully so, that there wasn't as much attention paid to some of the underlying causes, which this year, I think there was a greater conversation, at least in Vermont, with state authorities in what can we do to fix stream banks, to remove problems that really blocked water from flowing or caused a backflow up into a field and that sort of thing. And I think the state took that very serious, that conversation of how much soil was lost, how much field has been lost in 2 years. So there's some successes there. I wish it didn't take 2 years to get there, but something at least.
With that in mind, with the learning that went on, are there any practices that you've seen that have been happening more often in recent years to kind of compensate for this?
The Northeast, we've been early adapters and widespread across the region and across our farms in terms of our use of cover crops to always make sure we've got something green growing in our fields with a good root mass holding soil. I don't know if there's been an uptick, but we've definitely felt that practice has really helped us get through these major weather events. Practice I saw happen the most after these past 2 years of heavy flooding. We're doing work out in our fields that can control compaction. So with all that water on our fields and the soil being as saturated as it was for as long as it was, we really had to get in there and open that soil back up. So a lot of deep ripping and subsoiling has been going on in these past couple of years. 2024 fall was a godsend with its warm, dry weather, and it allowed farms to, 1, get their corn off early, 2, get their manure out early, 3, get their cover crops in earlier than we're used to, and then be able to then go out and kind of wrap it all up with some deep ripping and some subsoiling to really open the soil back up so that this winter it can go through the freeze and thaw cycles and settle back down for us next spring and kind of hit reset on our fields. So we had more of that. We had more acres being subsoiled than we've ever seen this fall.
Let's talk about when we've talked about flooding, but what about last year's wildfire smoke? Have you seen any impact from that, or is that something that is finished?
Yeah, we're not sure yet, honestly. We've had a hard time really pinpointing the impacts of the wildfire smoke. A lot of the nutritionists that we work with noticed that our forage quality coming out of 2023 on our grasses and even our corn that was not impacted by flooding had lower digestibility numbers. And a lot of that is just tied to stress in the plant. And a lot of us are thinking that is definitely the wildfire smoke had some impact there. But it's been really hard to really put a finger on how that impacted our growing season.
Just the impacts on health of whether that's the animal or the individual. Tom and I are out in it. Farmers can't really not be out in it. And then what does that do to cows who are out in it all year too? I don't even know how to begin to measure that on an impact side.
What impacts are farms seeing from the floods happening each year?
Yeah, we're seeing major losses of just stream bank erosion that is coming into our fields. The amount of gravel that has been deposited into our rivers over the last couple of years is reducing the amount of space in these rivers for the water that we're trying to move through them. And so therefore the impacts out on the cropland seems to be increasing more and more. And it's cutting into our riparian buffers and pulling trees that were, left there for years to stabilize the bank are now being ripped into the river. And that is not something that we can quickly get out there and plant and see any true impact from that work. So that's honestly the biggest thing. We've noticed a huge reduction in organic matter in our fields that have been underwater, and I have to attribute that to the ground being saturated and under anaerobic conditions for extended periods of time, which farms worked a long time to build up through cover cropping and reduced tillage and stuff like that. So no, there's been, and we're gonna be dealing with the impacts of these annual floods for years to come. Hopefully we'll get a year off.
Yeah, in Vermont, you're required to have at least 25 feet of vegetated buffer between the edge of your field and any water course. And so when you lose so much stream bank, you're then going to lose extra into the field by reestablishing that buffer. And like Tom said, so many farms have spent so many years thinking about soil health and doing these soil health practices and seeing that organic matter especially just get stronger and bigger, and some of the benefits of all of those practices, one event kind of washes it away, sets you back to zero. We know kind of how to get back there, but it's going to take time again.
Right. What are we talking about in years?
It doesn't take that long. I mean, each soil type kind of reacts differently under those management situations. And typically with cover cropping every year and doing as little amount of tillage as possible, we're able to kind of build our soil organic matter up fairly quickly. It's pretty impressive how fast it can happen. So I would say in 3 to 4 years, we should be back to where we were, and that'll be great. The other thing that it's going to take more than that to probably rebuild our farms inventories, feed inventories were so impacted in terms of just acres of crop, total crop loss, crops that were inundated with silt and residue and stuff that couldn't be fed or could only be fed to non-lactating cows, stuff like that. That's going to be really hard. And what we've noticed is the insurance policies that these farms have don't really take into account that you can't just say, well, that crop season is a loss. We have all these mouths that we have to feed in the Northeast. Rarely are these crops just going to the grain markets. I mean, I hope it's a benefit to come out of this. And we had some really good people from USDA, from Washington, come up and meet with us. And that was, I think, a huge take-home message was they need to kind of relook at the way crop insurance is handled, because it wasn't a total loss. It was a huge impact on quality, and we we're going to take a hit on milk, and we took a hit on inventory, but we have to still harvest those crops. We can't just walk away from the fields, which is what the policies are telling us we sometimes have to do.
Is there a range of percentage that was lost of total crops, corn, alfalfa, everything?
That's hard to say. I'm trying to remember what Vermont's totals were for 2023, and 2024 was probably half of what 2023 was. But, it's our river bottom farms, our hill farms did okay, definitely had some yield reductions. But the region as a whole, I would say 25 to 30% of the corn ground, which is, most of our highest productive river bottom soils, was impacted, maybe not lost.
Well, and probably new seeding of alfalfa that had to be impacted.
Yeah, that was something that farms, I think, were surprised by, was the corn stands handled the flooding so much better, and it has to do with, how deep their roots go, to where, the bottom of their root mass is still a part of the soil that had oxygen, and so the plants didn't totally die, where the shallow root systems of our grasses and our alfalfas that were underwater for that long, I mean, they were dead. They were complete losses. Any of those fields that got flooded were totally dead. And then even the grass stands that weren't maybe dead were just completely buried in sediment.
Yeah.
And farms, there was no way to harvest it without going in and really kind of moving that sediment out of fields. Mm-hmm. So the corn, surprisingly enough, was a lot more resilient.
I still see fields along the Lamoille River closer to where I am that are grass fields that still have just piles of sediment, sand in them, without turning it into an annual crop for a year. I don't know how you reset that, replant it or smooth it out. Any work you do in it is going to necessarily require basically a restart on that field.
How have the floods been changing the field plans? Are your farmers doing things differently in that way? And seed purchases and genetics, plant genetics for withstanding this. Is there anything that can be done that way?
I think on the manure side, more people seem interested in injection. It's always kind of been there and people like it, but I think there's more effort to either get the equipment yourself or hire somebody in who can do it, just so that you lose less of it. Plant-wise and availability of corn seed that is flood resistant. It's a little outside my wheelhouse, but that's kind of new news to me if we've got flood resistant corn.
Yeah, probably the root, like you were talking about, the root structure is probably the most important thing there.
Yeah, and I think that, like what I said earlier, where I think farms and most in general, people think, all right, if this ground is going to be as flooded as frequently as we're seeing right now, maybe we should keep it in a perennial grass type of setting, but it just dies. It just dies under those circumstances. So it's been interesting to watch farms who want to do everything that they can to protect the watershed and to protect their cropland. In their mind, they were thinking, boy, we're probably going to have to seed that down. But what they're realizing is we're not seeing losses from our fields in these floods. In the Northeast, we're steep valleys. We're seeing a lot of water rapidly move down into the valley, fill up the rivers, come out onto our land, and most of our fields are receivers of soil, not losers of soil. The corn tends to be able to handle that, and we don't think that there's really that much of a benefit in terms of reducing nutrient losses from our fields or soil losses from corn to grass. We're actually kind of thinking that the corn does all right in these flood zones, and it still provides the feed that's needed to feed the herds that we're dealing with up here.
I was going to say, there's so many farms up here where they grow corn where it's more level, right? And that tends to be in the river valleys, because your other option is a 8 to 12% slope on a field. And if you do try a year of corn there, how much soil loss do you end up with anyway? And it's just not worth it most of the time.
You had mentioned digestibility. What did it do to the corn digestibility?
It definitely drove it down. So yeah, digestibility took a hit. Our big concern and something that farms took action on at harvest was to use inoculants just to, really get this rapid fermentation to fight off mycotoxin growth and stuff like that. We were testing it, like I said, with the help of UVM and Cornell in New York, and making sure that before we harvested, we knew what we were going to be trying to ensile. Surprisingly, the mycotoxin levels weren't that high. They were higher than in a typical year. But through rapid fermentation and the use of inoculants and using all your best management practices when packing your bunks, we've been able to kind of fight that off and haven't really felt the pains of having these huge feed inventories loaded with mycotoxins that we then have to feed binders to the animals and stuff like that. We've been able to kind of avoid that. Through UVM was a big part of that, and driving the focus on making sure guys were going to use inoculants and the right inoculants, and then the state of Vermont actually stepping up and helping farmers pay for that added cost that they typically, I would say 50% of guys use inoculant, 50% use some acid. Some of them do it well and some of them don't. And I think it was another success that came out of all of this. Was it taught guys how to really focus on their feed management at the bunk during harvest to make sure that they put up good, safe feed for their cows.
Right. I was going to ask about mycotoxins, but yeah, certainly something to consider.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the manure management part of this. What changes are you seeing from farmers when it comes to their manure plans?
Injection is a really important tool, and it's something that I think there's more interest in, considering the seasonality of it too. I mean, it's something in the course of my career that I've seen is the folks who have been the most successful are the ones who think of their manure as a resource on the farm, are the ones who look at it as a source of nutrients, a soil amendment that can only help, grow whatever it is that they're trying to grow. The ones who maybe sort of struggled or have had higher expenses, et cetera, are the ones who look at it as just something I got to get rid of. So been more, I think, focus on, well, where are we going with manure? What times of the year to which fields? In Vermont, there's a winter spreading ban, so they're not allowed to spread manure after December 15th. Always makes people think about how empty is my pit going into December. Last year, this time, everybody got an exemption because everybody's pits were full because it pretty much never stopped raining. And so you got a lot of manure going out on fields at a time of year that was not completely ideal. And I think it also encouraged people to think about more storage. Sometimes it's not the best answer, but I think by and large, if you have more than 180 days of storage, you're going to be in a better position in the event of something like this, or even just the event of it starts snowing on Thanksgiving again, and we don't stop until almost Easter, right? Just having that space to play with in a pit versus knowing that as soon as the ban is up, I'm out there, I'm going because I have to.
Right.
And that often creates situations where I don't have a choice. I have to empty my pit. The weather's not ideal. I'm going. On the compliance side, that brings my conversations into it a little bit more in terms of if you're in that situation, where do you go? Which fields do you focus on? Where is the shallow depth to bedrock to avoid? Where are the high nitrogen leaching fields? Where are the ones that have a really close or easy proximity to surface water that we want to avoid? Trying to document that as well as encourage farms to think about those things ahead of time and less of a blanket spreading of, well, it's fall, I put it on the corn.
When can you go back in and start spreading then in the spring?
April 1st.
Okay.
Yeah, the ban is in Vermont is lifted on April 1st. New York's rules are a little different, and it's more around
situational.
3-4 inches of snow, 3-4 inches of frost, saturated soils you can't spread on. So that really kind of shrinks our ability to make sound decisions on any given day under any given field conditions. And so, one of the parts of your question talks about what changes are we seeing. We're seeing guys really invest in equipment that allows them to take advantage of the small windows that we do have, where the risk of spreading and having that result in a nutrient loss is low, so that they can get as much out under those situations as possible. So we're seeing a lot of investment in that. And it's twofold. It's one, to, help protect the environment, and two, it's about gaining efficiencies and better use of nutrients. And so guys are really understanding the value of that investment now, and definitely at the forefront.
It's been helpful to have a little bit more buy-in from NRCS too, in terms of funding things like a pump at a pit, or more storage, buried transfer lines, so that you're not running a hose for the drag line across the surface. You just have something that's hard lined in. It makes a big difference in management.
Do you have any success stories that you can share in regards to this, the manure management?
There's tons of them. The guys so the larger farms have a little easier ability to go out and make these huge capital investments. What has been nice is, like what Darren said, through state and federal funding, we've had some of the smaller farms be able to outfit themselves with dragline equipment, putting buried manure transfer lines in the ground, and just setting themselves up to when you can really go. You can get a lot done really quick with less people, less diesel engines rolling, all that. And then the other thing is, NRCS has stepped up, and they used to be able to only plan and fund around 180 days of storage. That then moved to 240. Now it's to 270, and really allowing farms to store their manure until the threat of flooding is gone. Unfortunately, what we've seen is the floods that have impacted Vermont have come at times that we're just not used to seeing it in the middle of July. We're used to spring and winter flooding, spring and fall. And spring is usually because of snow melt and ice jams, and we're just not seeing that in the last 10 years, really. So it's a little different mindset now. But that, and then injection equipment is really taken off, whether it's in corn or sod. Guys are doing a lot more injection. But yeah, we've got farms all over the state, in Vermont and New York, with miles upon miles of buried manure transfer line that just allow guys to move manure across the landscape quickly, efficiently, safely. The potential of tankers rolling over is gone once we put it into the ground, and it's a easier and lighter impact on the communities that we're farming in. So it's been really neat to watch that stuff get adapted out there.
I just wanted to talk about one farm we work with in Addison County, that it's a part of Vermont that is pretty notorious, famous. I don't know which word you want to use for heavy clay ground, which is very hard to work, and you have a very small window, especially in the spring, to get crops in, get manure out if you're going to do that. And a lot of farms down there would be do everything in the fall and then try to summer apply. But we have one particular client who, because they have a dragline system and enough storage, they're able to wait till the corn comes up a couple of inches and is out of the ground and is growing well, and they'll actually dragline across it, apply the manure to the growing corn in the early part of the summer, late spring. No real damage from the corn at that point, growing points below the ground. And I think it's made a huge difference in terms of their manure management strategy, as well as their fertilizer bill. They're able to save so much money because they're able to put those nutrients when the corn needs it, instead of banking on it being there the following spring, kind of a thing. That's just one that I was thinking of, that I think was a really neat, innovative solution that I have not seen anywhere else.
Yeah. So these drag lines, are they above ground, below ground? How do they do that?
I guess specifically what I'm thinking of, and most of the drag line itself, is kind of think of a really big garden hose attached to the back of a tractor, and then either to the manure pit or a frac tank or something like that. They're moving back and forth across the field and kind of snaking the hose behind them. You can attach that to a buried transfer line that has a standpipe that comes up out of the ground, depending on what your setup is. But once you're actually into the field, it's kind of that flexible hose setup.
Yeah, so the manure is being surface applied under the example Darren's talking about. Prior to the crop coming up or being even planted, it's generally injected. But we found it's really, you can't really inject on this heavy clay ground. Introducing any extra moisture to it makes it completely unworkable, untravelable. And so guys tend to tread very lightly in the spring on it, get their crops planted, and under the right soil conditions, we can then go out and top dress the corn, like Darren explained, in season. And it's great. It really reduces nitrogen purchases, and it's just a really good time to be spreading manure.
And how do the crops grow?
They respond tremendously. I mean, it's a little ugly for about a day or two to see these beautiful little corn rows and plants all covered in manure. Within a week or so, they really take off. They really darken up. You can tell the nitrogen's working. We've seen phenomenal yield results under that practice.
Are there any other strategy changes in manure that you've seen that are leading to improved yield?
Yeah, there's a handful here and there. We've got some guys playing around with some products that kind of change the chemical reaction of the ammonia in the manure when it hits the ground to make sure that it doesn't volatilize and it stays available to whether it's corn or grass. So we've seen folks making manure applications, whether it's tank applied or drag hose applied, injecting these products into the manure, pulling nitrogen out of the fertilizer program and seeing no yield drag. Most of them are seeing a nice little bump. And what's important is we're not seeing any impact or any reduction in terms of protein or digestibility numbers in our grass. And nitrogen is such a driver when it comes to forage quality on grasses that was our biggest concern with. If we're going to just straight manure on the surface, we tend to not really get the results we want from a forage quality standpoint. We get the yield, but the protein isn't there. There's a little bit of a lag in digestibility. And what we've noticed is these products, when used with manure, are the results are very similar to as if we were applying commercial fertilizer to those fields. And that's been great for us. There's a lot of research being done on that right now, and we want to keep digging into it. But that's been a pretty neat change that we've seen recently. We've seen a lot of manure injection.
I think the dribble bars too are a big one that have made a difference.
Oh, tell me about that.
I'm just going to throw it out there because Tom has seen them more than I have.
Yeah, so dribble bars are toolbars that are either on the back of a tank spreader or a drag line. When we're drag lining, we're using different toolbars. We're either using a traditional splash pan, an injection toolbar that puts the manure below the surface, or these dribble bars. And what we found is the dribble bars you can get them as wide as you want, and you're laying the manure down on the ground through hoses that band the manure on the surface below the plant canopy, whether it's most of the time we're talking they're using them on grass fields. The benefit to using them is that we're not injecting all this pressure. We're not trying to toss the manure 40 feet wide like we do with splash pans. When we do that, we introduce too much oxygen. We get really rapid volatilization of the nitrogen that is plant available. So essentially, we're just banding the manure down lightly below the grass canopy. So we're not completely covering the grass, like the actual tissue, the surface. So we see no reduction in growth and photosynthesis. All that seems to really keep charging along, and we're seeing really awesome results in terms of yields with the use of these dribble bars in our grass fields.
Mm-hmm.
And it extends the window that they can apply manure instead of having to be there a day, 2 days, after the field is mowed. You can be there. What would you say, Tom? A week, 2 weeks after?
You can dribble bar down into 10, 12 inches of grass that if we were to splash pan and surface apply and cover the entire grass field when the grass is 10 to 12 inches, the grass would burn. It's just too much. I mean, it would probably end up in our feed and cause issues from that standpoint. And it just completely kind of shuts off photosynthesis for a handful of days while the leaf surface is covered with manure. So by using these dribble bars, right, it's just extended the window that in the amount of acres that guys can cover in the middle of the summer in between cuttings. We've got a lot of guys that are using it on some cornfields. We are pulling commercial fertilizer and nitrogen out of our program. It's hard to really measure that ammonia capture, but based on the small amount of anecdotal stuff we've done, we feel that nitrogen is not volatilizing, is making it down into the soil, into the root zone, and the plants are able to use it. And we're not seeing any yield drags on reducing inputs in those situations. So
Do you have any closing recommendations that you could make for farmers based on what we've talked about today with the flood, what we've learned from the flood, and we talked about soil health and compaction and manure management?
And what I talk to all my guys about is setting themselves up for success by being able to take advantage of these small windows. It's so important to be ready to go, to have the right equipment to get the amount of manure that your herd generates out across your land base evenly, so that we're not overloading soils, so that we're using the nutrients to their most potential. And like I said, taking advantage of these small windows by having all the technology that's available to these guys today when it comes to manure management. We can get a lot done really fast with a small labor force, unlike in the past where we've got this crew of tankers driving around in circles, and half the time they're driving around empty because they're coming back to the farm to refill. When we're running these drag hoses, when we've got buried transfer lines, when we've got satellite storages out on the landscape and using frac tanks and all that, the manure really never stops moving, and it just really shrinks down the time that we're actually out applying manure. And so that's got to be the goal at the end of the day for farms that are dealing with manure. And then I think, and maybe Darren could touch on this a little bit more, but really talking to state and federal folks about what can be done from a floodplain management and mitigation. We need to really start addressing that as a industry.
I mean, that kind of leads into what I was thinking in terms of engage your team. You know, you hire folks like Tom and I to think about these sort of things, right? You have a nutritionist to try to work through these things. You have a herd manager, you have a vet, you have a banker. All of these people are part of your team that should be working for the success of your farm. If you ever feel like you're not fully engaging or getting the most out of them, I strongly encourage more communication, more contact, and figure out what more you can do. I think for our clients, the ones who get the most out of us are the ones who have no problem picking up the phone and giving a call or saying, you know, hey, I've got this idea, or have you heard about this? Or I'm heading to the NRCS office. What can I sign up for?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and having those conversations with folks and not feeling like you're taking advantage of anybody or, you know, wasting anybody's time. And in terms of manure management, picking your windows and having that opportunity to get out there when conditions are what you want them to be. And the more you can keep it in the ground, the better. You know, the less opportunity there is for it to leave the field. And then from a compliance side, when I'm writing a nutrient management plan each year, if it's going into the ground, we have a lot less concern about losses from the field, which means that you can meet a lot more of the crop need just with the resources you already have on the farm versus having to buy fertilizer. I think that's just a win-win all around. I think it's a win that isn't really fully expressed by the industry as a whole. You know, we get a lot of flack for all kinds of things in, you know, the press or from environmental groups or otherwise, when there are a lot of things that we do on an annual basis, on a yearly basis, that makes a big impact and improves things like soil health, reduces gas emissions, reduces, you know, nutrient loss to the environment. And those are the types of things that we really need to celebrate that more. And sort of an aside, but had a farm at an inspection this summer who really pushed on the Vermont agency to really kind of celebrate those wins more and get out there. And I love that when a farm can push back on a state agency and say, help us celebrate this, help us celebrate what we do here in the state, in our communities.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. We've been talking today with Darren Usinowicz and Tom Eaton from Agricultural Consultant Services. Do you gentlemen have a website that you want to share?
ACS.com. You can also go to Dairy One, find us there. We cover all of the Northeast pretty much, I would say. Not just Tom and I, but we have a pretty robust team that I'm really proud to work with.
We're going to wrap this up. And remember, this is just episode 1. We're going to record episode 2, and then it'll be out soon for you to listen to. But in the meantime, I'm Connie Kuber with Sealpro Silage Barrier Film by Connor AgriScience, and you have been listening to the Dairy Voice by Dairy Business News. Please subscribe, like, and share this podcast. And we appreciate the efforts of all dairy farmers and all of our industry that works with dairy farmers to help them be successful. Good luck in the new year. Stay safe and well. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.